When my cousins sneered, "She's not family," everyone laughed, everyone except me, because 10 minutes later, my stepfather would make sure I remembered my place. But the next day, a neighbor waved from across the fence, and that single gesture would start the quietest, coldest revenge anyone in Willow Bend had ever seen. My name is Mara Linton, and on a sweltering July afternoon in Willow Bend, Ohio, I was turning burgers on a grill that had seen better days. I was 33 years old, and my life was measured in summers like this one, each marked by the same sticky heat, the same cloying scent of citronella, and the same brittle performance of family. The sun beat down on the manicured lawn of my stepfather's house, the kind of perfect green carpet that required chemicals and a strict watering schedule. Around the long picnic table, my family, or rather, Carl's family, laughed. It was a loud, performative sound, designed to carry over the fence lines and announce to the neighborhood that the Lintons were happy, whole, and thriving. I listened to the sound, trying to separate the individual threads. There was my stepmother, Donna, with her high, bird-like trill, my cousin, Rachel, whose laughter was more of a sharp, barking sound, always punctuated with a flick of her blonde hair. And then there was Carl, my stepfather, his laugh a low rumble that commanded the space, the final punctuation on every joke. They were a symphony of suburban contentment, but I wasn't listening to the music. I was listening to the silence in between. All I could hear was the rhythmic scrape of my metal spatula against the grill's grate, the aggressive sizzle of fat dripping onto hot coals, and the frantic, unsteady thrum of my own heart. It was a drumbeat of dread that had become the soundtrack to my existence. The air was thick with the smells of summer freshly cut grass, charcoal, and the sweet perfume from Donna's prize-winning roses that climbed the white trellis by the porch. But to me, it all smelled like a lie. Every perfectly arranged platter of food, every ice-cold beer sweating onto a colorful coaster, every cheerful anecdote was part of an elaborate stage play, and I, as always, was cast in the role of the stagehand, the background character whose only job was to keep the props in place and stay out of the spotlight. I flipped a row of hot dogs, the cheap kind in the bulk pack that Carl insisted on buying, and felt a bead of sweat trace a path down my temple. "Mara, honey, don't let those burn," Donna called, her voice sweet, but edged with a familiar anxiety. She was sitting at the head of the table, fanning herself with a paper plate, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. I didn't answer, just gave a slight nod. Answering invited conversation, and conversation invited attention. Attention was the last thing I wanted. I focused on the task, on the char lines forming on the meat, on the precise moment to flip each piece. It was a simple, mechanical job, a refuge from the complex and treacherous currents of the conversation at the table. They were talking about Rachel's recent promotion at the local bank, a topic that had been rehashed at least 4 times. They just know talent when they see it. Carl was booming, clapping his hand on Rachel's shoulder. "That's a Linton for you. We know how to get things done." Rachel preened, soaking in the praise. She was 30, 3 years my junior, but in this world, she was light years ahead. She was a true Linton. I was just there, the quiet, awkward remnant of my mother's first, failed marriage, a ghost at the feast. She caught my eye from across the lawn, a flicker of something sharp and unpleasant in her gaze. It was a look I knew well. It was the look that preceded a jab, a casual cruelty disguised as a joke. I braced myself, my hand tightening on the spatula. She waited for a lull in the conversation, a perfect, theatrical pause. Then, she leaned forward, her voice carrying clearly across the yard. "Honestly, I don't know how we managed all these years before you moved back in. Mara," she began, her tone dripping with false sweetness. "Who would have burnt the burgers for us?" A few people chuckled uneasily. Donna's smile tightened, but Rachel wasn't finished. She looked around the table, a conspiratorial smirk playing on her lips, and then her eyes landed back on me. "It's good you're here to help, though," she said, her voice dropping just enough to sound like an intimate aside. yet loud enough for everyone to hear. She turned to her mother, Carl's sister. She's not family, remember, so she doesn't mind pitching in. There it was, the line, the one that had defined my entire existence in this house, in this town. She's not family. The words hung in the humid air for a second, stark and ugly. Then, the laughter started. It wasn't the uneasy chuckle from before. This was real laughter, rolling from Rachel's friends, from her father, from distant cousins who barely knew my name. It washed over the picnic table in a wave of casual dismissal, a collective agreement. It affirmed my status. I was the outsider, the help, the charity case. I kept my back to them, my eyes fixed on the grill. The smoke stung my eyes, a convenient excuse for the moisture gathering there. I watched as a drop of grease hit a coal and erupted in a flash of orange flame. I saw my stepmother, Donna, out of the corner of my eye. She didn't laugh, but she didn't defend me, either. She just picked up her iced tea, her knuckles white around the glass, and took a long, slow sip. Her gaze directed firmly at the potato salad. Her silence was louder than their laughter. It was the silence of complicity, of a choice made long ago to prioritize her own safety over my dignity. And then there was Carl. I didn't have to look to know what he was doing. I could feel his eyes on my back, a heavy, judgmental weight. I chanced a glance over my shoulder. He wasn't laughing. His face was a mask of geniality, the perfect host. But as his eyes met mine, he gave a slow, deliberate arch of one eyebrow. It was a minuscule movement, almost imperceptible. To anyone else, it would have meant nothing. To me, it was a telegram. It was a clear, concise message that I had heard 1,000 times before. You are making a scene. You are embarrassing me. You will pay for this later. Wait until we get home. Except we were home, his home, which meant the waiting would be short. A cold knot formed in my stomach, tight and painful. The old fear, the familiar companion, wrapped its icy fingers around my ribs. For a moment, I felt the urge to drop the spatula, to run, to just disappear. But then, something else surfaced. Something hard and defiant that had been growing inside me for months. I took a slow, deep breath, the smoky air filling my lungs. I turned back to the grill. I looked down at the last burger, the one I had left on a moment too long. It was blackened on one side, a disk of carbon and regret. My movements were deliberate, almost serene. I slid the spatula under the ruined burger, lifted it carefully, and walked the few steps to the picnic table. The laughter had died down, and the conversation had already moved on. No one was paying attention to me now. I reached past a bowl of coleslaw and, with a steady hand, placed the burnt offering directly onto Rachel's plate, right next to her pristine macaroni salad. I didn't say a word. I just turned and walked back to my station at the grill. It was a pathetic rebellion, a silent scream that no one heard. But it was mine. I felt a tremor run through my hand, and I gripped the wooden handle of the spatula until my fingers ached. The grease sizzled and popped, spitting hot droplets onto my forearm, but I barely felt the sting. They were already dissecting some local political scandal, their voices rising and falling in predictable rhythms, the moment of my humiliation already forgotten. But I would not forget. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur of forced pleasantries. I served the food, cleared the plates, and answered any direct questions with single, non-committal words. When the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, the guests started to leave. Their cars pulled away from the curb with friendly honks and waves, leaving behind a yard littered with the debris of manufactured joy. As I was gathering empty chip bowls from the table, Carl came up behind me. He didn't touch me, but I could feel the heat radiating from his body. His voice was a low whisper, meant only for me. You embarrassed me today, Mara. I didn't turn around. I just stacked one bowl on top of the other, the plastic making a soft clatter. I didn't say anything. You didn't have to, he hissed, his voice dangerously quiet. That stunt with the burger. You think I didn't see that? You think you're clever. The knot in my stomach tightened. I knew what would happen next. It was a ritual as predictable as this annual cookout. He would wait until Donna was upstairs, pretending to be asleep. Then he would find me, and he would teach me a lesson about respect, about knowing my place. The familiar script played out in my mind, a horror movie I had seen too many times. I knew the blows would come. But this time, there was a new scene in the movie. This time, I had a plan. As I stood there, absorbing his threat, my eyes drifted across the lawn, past the row of Donna's perfect roses, to the fence that separated our property from the one next door. The house had been sold a few months ago. The new owner was a quiet man, a retiree named Gray Bennett. He kept to himself, mostly, but I'd seen him watching, not in a creepy way, in a quiet, observant way. And just as Carl's footsteps receded towards the house, I saw him. Mr. Bennett was standing by his own back porch, coiling a garden hose. He wasn't looking at me, not directly, but as he straightened up, his eyes met mine across the twilight-dusted lawn. He saw the empty picnic table, the mess, and me, standing alone in the middle of it all. He must have heard the laughter. He must have seen the tension. He saw everything. He didn't smile or offer a sympathetic look. He just gave a short, sharp nod. It was a simple gesture, but it landed like a stone in the placid, poisonous pond of my life. It was a nod of acknowledgement, of witness. And in that moment, I knew I wasn't just a victim waiting for the inevitable. I was a woman with a plan, and my plan had just found its first, and most important, ally. The house was a long, low ranch, the kind that was supposed to represent the American dream in the 1970s, and now just looked tired. Its white vinyl siding was perpetually dingy, no matter how often Carl power washed it. Inside, it was a tomb of beige carpets and gray curtains that seemed to suck the light out of the rooms. The air was a constant, cloying mix of lemon-scented cleaner and the faint, underlying smell of dampness from the basement, the smell of secrets being scrubbed away, but never truly gone. Every wall was a fresh coat of paint over a history I knew too well, a pristine surface hiding a foundation of rot. This house wasn't a home. It was a container. It was where Donna and Carl kept their perfect life, and it was where they kept me. After the last guest had gone and the flimsy paper plates had been bagged for trash, the manufactured cheer of the cookout evaporated, leaving behind a silence that was heavier than any sound. Donna went inside first, her shoulders slumped, the perfect hostess mask falling away to reveal the exhausted woman underneath. I followed, my steps quiet on the linoleum of the kitchen. Carl came in last, shutting the sliding glass door with a soft click that echoed like a gunshot in the still house. He didn't speak. He just went to the liquor cabinet and poured himself a whiskey. The glug of the amber liquid into the glass the only sound. I knew the protocol. I was to make myself scarce, to disappear into the background until he had consumed enough alcohol to fuel his righteousness, or enough to make him forget. I started for my room, a small, dark space at the back of the house that overlooked the overgrown woods behind our property. "Stay right there," he said. His voice was calm, almost gentle, which was always the most dangerous sign. I stopped, my hand on the doorknob. I didn't turn around. I just waited. My gaze fixed on the wood grain of the door. I could hear the clink of his glass as he set it on the counter, the soft thud of his footsteps on the carpet as he approached. Then, the whisper of leather. I squeezed my eyes shut. It was his belt, the thick one with the heavy silver buckle he only wore on Sundays. He stopped right behind me. I could smell the whiskey on his breath, a sour, sweet scent that made my stomach clench. He didn't raise his voice. He never did. Not at first. "You have no respect," he said, his voice a low murmur against my ear. "You think you can act out in front of my family, in my house, and there won't be consequences. You think you can make me look like a fool?" The first strike was a surprise, as it always was, a sharp, stinging blow across my shoulders that made me gasp, my body jolting forward. The pain was immediate, a searing line of fire. It wasn't about the pain, though. Not really. It was about the humiliation. It was about the power. He wanted me to know my place, to remember that in this house, I was nothing. I was a guest who had long overstayed her welcome, a problem to be managed. He didn't hit me again. One was usually enough to make the point. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, the final twist of the knife. "You go tell anyone. You try to make trouble for me," he breathed, the words slithering into my ear. "And I'll tell them all what you are, a liar, an ungrateful little brat who I took in out of the goodness of my heart. No one's going to believe you, not a soul in this town." He stepped back. I heard the slide of the leather as he refastened his belt, the click of the buckle a sound of finality. He picked up his drink and walked into the living room, turning on the television. The canned laughter of a sitcom filled the silence. For him, it was over. The lesson had been administered. Order was restored. I stood there for a long moment, my back on fire, my breath caught in my throat. Then, on legs that felt like they were made of glass, I walked to the bathroom. I locked the door, the flimsy lock offering the illusion of security. I didn't turn on the main light, just the dim vanity bulbs that flanked the mirror. The face that stared back at me was pale, my eyes wide and dark in the sallow light. Slowly, I turned, craning my neck to see my back in the mirror. Through the thin fabric of my t-shirt, I could already see the welt forming a dark, angry red line that bisected my shoulder blade. It would be a deep, ugly purple by morning, a secret I would have to carry under my clothes, a hidden tattoo of my worthlessness. I opened the medicine cabinet. My hand was steady as I took out the thick, opaque foundation, the one I kept for this exact purpose. It was part of the routine, the final act of the ritual, the abuse, and then the concealment. I squeezed a dollop onto my fingers and began the painstaking process of dabbing it onto my skin, the cool cream a strange contrast to the burning heat of the bruise. Cover it up, hide it, pretend it didn't happen. That was the rule. A soft knock came at the door. Mara. It was Donna. My hand froze. "Are you all right in there?" she asked, her voice muffled by the door. I didn't answer. I just stood there, my reflection a statue of shame. The doorknob rattled, but the lock held. There was a pause. "Mara, please," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Just don't make things worse." Don't make things worse. It was her mantra, the prayer she repeated to get through her life. Don't provoke him. Don't challenge him. Don't give him a reason. Accept the quiet misery, because the alternative was a loud and terrifying unknown. For years, I had believed her. I believed that silence was survival, that invisibility was my only shield. My life was a long, slow exercise in making myself smaller, quieter, less present, all in the hopes of not making things worse. But as I stood there, listening to her footsteps retreat down the hall, something shifted inside me. The foundation on my fingers felt thick and greasy, like a lie. And the words, "No one's going to believe you," echoed in my head, not as a threat, but as a challenge. I looked at my own eyes in the mirror, and for the first time, I didn't see fear. I saw a cold, hard resolve. And then I heard it. A sound from outside, cutting through the thin walls of the bathroom. It was faint, but unmistakable. A sharp, mechanical click, the sound of a camera shutter. My heart stopped, my breath hitched. I moved to the small, frosted window at the side of the bathroom and peered through a clear spot in the glass, across the yard, in the house next door. A light was on in an upstairs window, and in that window, I could just make out a silhouette. A man, standing perfectly still. Mr. Gray Bennett, the retired police officer. He had been on his porch. He had seen me, and Carl's voice had been low, but the sliding door had been left slightly ajar. Sounds carry on a quiet night. Had he heard? Had he seen? The thought was both terrifying and electrifying. I had spent my entire life convinced I was alone in this, that the walls of this house were soundproof, that my suffering was invisible. But maybe it wasn't. The next day, I moved through the house like a ghost. Carl was cheerful, the benevolent patriarch once more. Donna was quiet, her eyes avoiding mine. The bruise on my back was a dull, throbbing ache, a constant reminder, all day. I fought the urge to look out the window, to watch the house next door. Hope was a dangerous thing, and I had learned long ago not to indulge in it. Late in the afternoon, I went to get the mail. It was a mundane chore, a brief escape into the fresh air. I walked down the driveway, the sun warm on my face. I opened the little metal door of our mailbox. Bills, junk mail, a catalog for Donna, and underneath it all, a single white envelope. It was thick, heavy, with no stamp and no address. Just my name, Mara, written in a neat, strong block script. My hands started to tremble. I knew, with a certainty that defied logic, who it was from. I shoved the rest of the mail under my arm and clutched the envelope to my chest, my heart hammering against my ribs. I walked back to the house, went straight to my room, and locked the door. I sat on the edge of my bed and tore it open. Inside, there was a small, folded piece of paper and a small black object, a USB flash drive. I unfolded the note, the same neat block letters, 5 words. I saw what he did. Keep this safe. I stared at the words, reading them over and over. I saw what he did. He saw. Someone saw. The words were a lifeline, a flare in the suffocating darkness. I wasn't crazy. It wasn't my fault. It was real. And someone else knew it. For the first time in as long as I could remember, I didn't feel completely and utterly alone. With shaking fingers, I plugged the USB drive into my old, slow laptop. A single folder appeared on the screen. I clicked it open. There was one file inside, a video file. The thumbnail was a grainy night vision image of our back porch, of me, of Carl. My finger hovered over the mouse. I knew what I would see. I knew the audio would capture his voice, his threats. I knew it would capture the sound of the leather, my gasp of pain. It was a recording of my deepest shame. But it was also something else. It was proof. It was truth. It was a weapon. I looked from the screen to the note in my hand. Keep this safe. He was giving me a choice. He wasn't going to save me. He was giving me the tools to save myself. I looked at the small, black flash drive in my hand. It was an object of immense power, a tiny vessel containing a truth that could shatter the pristine facade of the Linton family. It could dismantle the white walls, tear down the gray curtains, and expose the rot underneath for the whole world to see. Carl's words came back to me. No one's going to believe you. I smiled, a slow, cold smile that didn't reach my eyes. I knew then that this wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about justice. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that this small piece of plastic and metal, this digital record of his cruelty, if used at exactly the right time and in exactly the right way, had the power to destroy them all. In a town like Willow Bend, reputation is a currency more valuable than cash. It's built over years of potluck dinners, church bake sales, and meticulously maintained lawns. And in this town, my family, the Lintons, were fabulously wealthy. They weren't the kind of family with a sprawling mansion on a hill. Their power was quieter, more insidious. They were good people. You'd hear it at the grocery store, at the post office, over the counter at the diner. Carl and Donna Linton. People would say with a reverent nod, such a model couple, with a good, solid home. Their public image was a masterpiece of suburban artistry. Carl was the salt-of-the-earth local businessman, the owner of Linton's Automotive. He was the honest mechanic, a dying breed, a man whose handshake was his bond, who would show you the faulty part he'd replaced on your car with a solemn look of shared frustration at the cost of things these days. On Sundays, he was a pillar of the First Baptist Church, his hands, still faintly smelling of motor oil, slipping a generous check into the collection plate with a humble dip of his head. He sponsored the local Little League team. Their name, Linton's Automotive, emblazoned across the backs of a dozen 10-year-olds in a perfect photo opportunity for the Willow Bend Chronicle. He was stability. He was integrity. He was a lie from the ground up. And beside him, always, was Donna, Saint Donna of the Sunday School. She taught the 5-year-olds, her voice a soft, patient murmur as she guided their clumsy hands through crafts involving glitter and glue sticks. Other mothers adored her, saw in her a serene, maternal grace they aspired to. "She has the patience of a saint," they'd whisper, watching her wipe a teary child's nose. They didn't see the flicker of panic in her eyes when a child raised their voice too loudly. They didn't know that her patience wasn't grace. It was a finely honed survival mechanism, a lifetime of practice in placating unpredictable tempers. Then there was Rachel, the jewel in their crown, the living proof of their success. She was the product of their perfect union, a walking, talking embodiment of the Linton brand. In high school, she was the homecoming queen. Now, she was a loan officer at the town's only bank, her smiling face on a poster in the window. She was on the town festival planning committee, her name always mentioned in the paper. She moved through Willow Bend with an unshakable confidence, perpetually boasting about her wonderful, supportive, perfect family. She was their greatest creation and their most polished lie. And me, I was the footnote, the awkward addendum to their family portrait. "Oh, that's Mara," people would say, their voices dropping. "Donna's daughter from her first marriage. You know, I was the stray, the piece that didn't quite fit." At church events, when the families gathered for photos after the service, a subtle choreography would take place. Donna would gently guide me to the edge of the group, or Carl would conveniently step in front of me, his broad shoulders blocking me from the camera's view. I was a necessary presence, but not a featured one. My existence was a quiet reminder that their perfection had a messy backstory, and they worked tirelessly to keep that story in the shadows. Over the years, the town had formed its own narrative about me. I was quiet Mara, shy, a bit strange, socially awkward. People would offer me sympathetic smiles, assuming my silence was born of a gentle, introverted nature. No one knew that my quietness was a cage I had built around myself. Brick by brick, I avoided the light not because I was shy, but because the light was dangerous. The light was where you were seen, and being seen by Carl was the most dangerous thing of all. You learn to live in the shadows when the man who runs the house is a monster. But the USB drive in my sock drawer changed the nature of light. That grainy video, a secret held by me and the quiet man next door, wasn't the harsh, exposing glare of a spotlight. It was a different kind of light, the first I had ever known. It was the cold, clear light of evidence. It was the kind of light that doesn't just illuminate, it incinerates, and it sparked a change in me that no one in that house could have possibly anticipated. My survival strategy had always been to retreat, to make myself smaller, to fade into the gray curtains and beige walls. But that strategy had only ever guaranteed that I would live to be hurt another day. The new strategy was the opposite. I had to move closer to the fire. I had to become the person they thought they wanted me to be. It started in the kitchen. The morning after I received the envelope from Mr. Gray, I got up before anyone else. I made coffee, the good kind Carl liked. I made pancakes from scratch, not from a box. When Carl came into the kitchen, his face a mask of sleepy irritation, he stopped short, staring at the plate I set before him. "What's all this?" he grumbled. "Just thought I'd make breakfast," I said, my voice even and soft. I didn't look him in the eye. I just filled his coffee cup and turned back to the stove. He was suspicious at first. So was Donna. My sudden domesticity was out of character. I started asking Donna about her garden, listening with feigned interest as she talked about aphids and fertilizer. I complimented a new dress Rachel bought. I started smiling more, a small, placid smile that cost me a universe of effort. I answered their questions with more than one word. I became, for all intents and purposes, a model stepdaughter. And after a week of suspicion, they began to relax. They began to believe it. Their expressions became smug, satisfied. They exchanged knowing glances when they thought I wasn't looking. In their minds, they had finally won. Carl's last lesson had worked. The quiet, sullen girl had finally been broken, and in her place was a pliant, obedient servant. They thought I had finally learned to accept my place. They were fools. They forgot who I was before I came to this house. They forgot that for 2 years at Ohio State's community college campus, before I had to drop out, I studied accounting. Numbers don't lie, people do. Carl and Donna and Rachel had built their lives on a foundation of lies, but I suspected their finances told a truer story. To them, I was the girl who couldn't be trusted to make small talk at a party. They had no idea I could read a balance sheet like a novel. My opening came on a Saturday morning 2 weeks later. Carl was in the garage, cursing at a stubborn engine. He was short a mechanic and was buried in work. I walked in, holding a cup of coffee for him. "Looks like you're busy," I said, my voice carefully neutral. He grunted, wiping grease from his forehead with the back of his hand. "Tell me something I don't know. This whole damn town decided to break down this week." I took a breath. I was thinking. I started, letting my voice trail off shyly. "The office looks a little disorganized. All those papers. If you want, I could sort through some things. Just filing invoices, whatever you need, to help out." He stared at me, his eyes narrowing. He was searching for the angle, the trick. I just held his gaze, my expression one of earnest, simple-minded helpfulness. The girl who burns burgers and is now offering to file papers. It was pathetic. It was perfect. "Finally," he shrugged. "Knock yourself out," he said, taking the coffee. "Keys to the office are on the hook. Just don't touch anything on my desk." It was that easy. The keys felt heavy in my hand, heavier than their simple weight. I walked into the small, cramped office behind the garage. It smelled of stale coffee, oil, and desperation. Piles of greasy invoices, receipts, and order forms overflowed from cardboard boxes. It was a mess. It was a treasure trove. I started where he told me to, with a box of paid invoices from the last quarter, for hours. I sat there, methodically creating a system, alphabetizing, filing. I did the work he expected me to do, but with every invoice I touched, I was reading, I was memorizing, part numbers, suppliers, costs, labor charges. I was building a map of his business in my mind. It was late in the afternoon when I found it. It wasn't a smoking gun. It was something small, almost insignificant, a monthly invoice, for a substantial amount, from a supplier I didn't recognize, Westline Parts. The invoice itself was different from the others. The font was a standard Times New Roman, not a company letterhead. The address listed was just a PO box in a neighboring county. There was no phone number. It was an invoice for high-performance engine parts, the kind you'd use for custom builds, not the standard sedans and minivans that made up most of Carl's business. A cold thrill, sharp and clean, cut through me. This was it. This was the loose thread. Carl thought I was in here being a good little girl, tidying up his mess. He had no idea I was an auditor, and I had just begun my audit. He had invited me into the heart of his kingdom, never imagining that I was the one person who knew how to look for the rot beneath the throne. The garage office became my sanctuary, my war room. The scent of grease and old paper was the smell of purpose. I spent every Saturday there, surrounded by the mundane architecture of Carl's deceit. My official role was to bring order to his chaotic paperwork, a task he was happy to offload. My real work began after he'd leave for lunch, trusting the quiet girl to be nothing more than a glorified filing clerk. He was right. I was quiet, but my mind was screaming. The Westline Parts invoices were the starting point. They were a ghost in his machine. I took the stack of them and began the tedious work of cross-referencing. I'd pull a work order for, say, a Ford Explorer that came in for brake pads and an oil change. Then I'd find Carl's corresponding invoice to the customer. Simple, straightforward. But in the box of expenses he filed for taxes, I'd find an invoice from Westline Parts for that same day, claiming he'd purchased a high-performance fuel injection system, a part worth thousands of dollars. The numbers were laughably inflated. He wasn't just padding the expenses, he was inventing them whole cloth. His tax filings claimed his cost of parts was nearly double what he actually spent. Westline Parts was a phantom, a shell company created for the sole purpose of siphoning money out of the business and into his pocket, all under the guise of legitimate expenses. Paper was good, but digital was better. It was permanent. It was easily copied. His computer, a beige tower humming under the desk, was the vault. Getting into it was a risk, but a necessary one. I created the opportunity myself. One afternoon, while Carl was on the phone with a supplier, I staged a clumsy accident, spilling a large cup of lukewarm coffee across a table stacked with that year's receipts. His roar of anger was predictable. My performance of a flustered, apologetic idiot was, by now, second nature. "I'm so sorry. Carl," I stammered, dabbing uselessly at the mess with paper towels. "I can try to dry them out, but some of them might be ruined." I let a tear well in my eye for good measure. Maybe I should be scanning these instead, to make a digital backup, so this doesn't happen again. He glared at me, then at the mess, his mind clearly calculating the hassle of it all. "Fine," he snapped. "Just don't screw it up." His password was Linton Auto 1. It took me less than 30 seconds to guess. The machine was a digital reflection of his paper lies. He had 2 sets of everything. One folder was labeled Books, the other was Tax Prep. Inside Books were the real numbers, the modest profits of a small-town mechanic. But inside Tax Prep was a work of fiction. The Excel spreadsheets were a masterclass in fraud. Columns of figures were inflated. Labor hours were doubled. And the largest expense, by a huge margin, was a recurring payment to Westline Parts. My heart hammered against my ribs as I worked. Every time a car pulled into the garage, every time I heard footsteps outside the office door, I'd minimize the screen. My hands flying back to the scanner, I bought a tiny USB drive, no bigger than my thumbnail, and began the transfer. With each file that copied over, the balance of power in our silent war shifted. The files were meticulously organized on his end, a testament to his arrogance. He never dreamed anyone would see them, let alone understand them. I downloaded every spreadsheet, every doctored invoice template for Westline Parts, every fraudulent tax return from the last 5 years. Curiosity pushed me further. I opened his email client, a simple program cluttered with messages. My excuse, if he walked in, would be that I was organizing his customer database, but I wasn't looking for customers. I typed reimbursement into the search bar. My breath caught in my throat. There they were, a string of emails, sent every month like clockwork. They were mostly to Rachel. The subject line was always the same monthly. The body of the email was terse, $500 transferred, for car/expenses, but then there were others, less frequent. To an email address I recognized as Donna's private one, the one she used for her online prayer groups. Cash for house. One read, "For your extras," said another. They were cash reimbursements, untraceable payments. It wasn't just hush money, it was a profit-sharing plan. They were all in on it. Donna's silence. Rachel's cruelty, it wasn't just a dysfunctional family dynamic, it was the behavior of co-conspirators, protecting their golden goose. My quiet suffering was the cost of their comfortable lives. Their new clothes, their garden club memberships. I felt a surge of ice-cold clarity. I took my phone, angled it to avoid any glare, and took sharp, clear pictures of every single email. I saved them to the USB drive, right alongside the spreadsheets. I had it all, the method, the numbers, the accomplices, the old me, the scared Mara. Would have been terrified by this knowledge. The new me felt a grim sense of purpose. I held the keys to their destruction. I could walk out of that office, drive to the nearest IRS field office, and end it all. But I didn't. Revenge, I was learning, was not a dish best served cold. It was a dish best served publicly. At the height of the feast, a quiet federal investigation would be too merciful. Carl would get a lawyer, plead out, maybe serve a short sentence in a low-security facility. Donna and Rachel would plead ignorance. The town of Willow Bend would whisper about it for a few months. and then the story would fade. The Lintons' reputation would be tarnished, but they would survive. It wasn't enough. I didn't want them to be arrested. I wanted them to be ruined. I wanted their public image, the very thing they valued more than anything, to be shattered so completely that they could never piece it back together. I decided to wait. I would let them climb higher, so the fall would be that much greater. The perfect opportunity was delivered, as most things in that family were. On a wave of arrogance and cheap wine, it was a Friday night, and we were having dinner. Rachel was flushed with excitement, her voice louder than usual. "You are all looking at the daughter of the man who is about to become a very important city contractor," she announced, raising her wineglass. Carl beamed, a smug, self-satisfied look on his face. Donna fluttered her hands in a gesture of nervous pride. "Oh, Rachel, don't speak too soon," she said, but she was smiling. "It's practically a done deal," Rachel slurred slightly, waving her hand dismissively. "They're announcing it in the fall. Carl's getting the contract to service the entire city fleet. Police cars, city trucks, everything. No more worries for us. Mom, we're set." I kept my face perfectly neutral, taking a slow sip of water. I could feel Carl's eyes on me, daring me not to be happy for him. I offered up a small, empty smile. Inside, my mind was racing, connecting the dots with dizzying speed. A city contract. That wasn't just a private job. That was public money. The vetting process would be, or should be, stringent. "That's wonderful," I said, my voice a soft murmur. "A city contract must be worth a lot." Carl leaned back in his chair, puffing out his chest. "Over 800,000 a year. For 5 years," he said, the numbers rolling off his tongue. "They don't just give those to anyone. They need to know you're reliable, that your financials are clean as a whistle." Clean as a whistle. The irony was so thick I could have choked on it. I looked at their happy, triumphant faces. Rachel, already spending the money in her head. Donna, seeing a future of security, free from financial worry. Carl, seeing the ultimate symbol of his success and untouchable reputation in Willow Bend. They were standing at the edge of a cliff, celebrating the view, completely unaware that I was standing behind them, ready to push. The files on my USB drive were no longer just evidence of past crimes. They were a loaded gun pointed directly at their future. A few well-timed, anonymous emails to the city council, to the local newspaper, containing a handful of spreadsheets, would be all it took to turn their celebration into an inferno. I smiled again, a real smile this time, though I hid it behind my glass of water. The plan was coming together, the numbers were the proof. The noise of Rachel's bragging had provided the timeline, but it still felt incomplete. An anonymous email could be dismissed. I needed something more, something undeniable. The financial fraud was the body of their crime, but I needed to show the town their soul. I needed one more trigger, one final, public display of their true nature to ensure that when they fell, no one would be there to catch them. The weeks that followed were a study in quiet observation. I continued my work in the garage office, my performance as the dutiful, simple-minded helper now so polished it felt like a second skin. Inside, I was a coiled spring, a hunter waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I had the means and the motive, but the timing was a delicate calculation I replayed in my mind 1,000 times a day. It was during a lull in this tense waiting game, on a Tuesday afternoon when the house was blessedly empty, that a soft knock came at the front door. My first instinct was suspicion. Unexpected visitors were rare. I peered through the peephole and my breath caught. It was Mr. Gray Bennett, his posture straight and steady, his expression unreadable. In his hands, he held a pie in a simple glass dish. It was so jarringly normal, so fundamentally kind, that it threw me completely off balance. I opened the door, a question in my eyes. "Smelled the apples from my kitchen and figured I'd made too much," he said, his voice a calm, low baritone. He offered the pie to me. "Hope you don't mind." "Oh," I said, my voice barely a whisper. I took the pie, the dish still warm in my hands. It smelled of cinnamon and baked apples. a scent from a life I couldn't remember having. Thank you. You didn't have to. Being a neighbor isn't about what you have to do, he replied simply. He glanced past me into the silent house. Looks quiet today. Yes, they're all out. He nodded slowly, his gaze returning to me. It was a policeman's gaze, I realized, not accusatory, but deeply observant. It felt as though he could see the spreadsheets and video files I had stored away, as if he could read the fine print of the bruises that had long since faded from my skin. You okay? Mara, he asked. The question soft, but direct. The lie came to my lips automatically, a reflex honed over years of practice. I forced a small, brittle smile. I'm fine, just clumsy. I took a bit of a fall a few weeks ago, but I'm all better now. It was the standard script, the one victims learn to recite to ER doctors, to concerned teachers, to anyone who gets too close. It was a test. I wanted to see if he would accept the lie, if he would retreat into the comfort of plausible deniability like everyone else. He didn't. He didn't press or challenge me, but he didn't accept the lie either. He just held my gaze for a moment longer, a flicker of something profound and sorrowful in his eyes, not pity, but a deep, weary understanding. He nodded again, a gesture of closure. Well, you take care of yourself. I invited him in for tea, a sudden, impulsive act of gratitude. To my surprise, he accepted. We sat at the kitchen table, the very table where I had heard the city contract announced, the pie sitting between us like a treaty. We made small talk about the weather, about his garden. He told me he'd been a detective in Cleveland for 30 years before retiring to Willow Bend to be closer to his grandchildren. The conversation was light, but the space between the words was filled with everything we weren't saying. As he was getting ready to leave, he set his teacup down with a soft click. He looked at me, his face serious. His voice was so quiet, I had to lean in to hear it. I spent 30 years in a world full of noise. Mara, shouting, sirens, lies. You learn to listen to the quiet things, and you learn that people get put in situations where they think they only have one choice. He paused, his eyes holding mine. I've been where you are, in a place that feels like there's no way out, but there's always a choice. You can choose silence, or you can choose justice. You just can't have both. He stood up, thanked me for the tea, and left. I watched him walk across the lawn, his back straight, until he disappeared into his own house. I was left alone in the kitchen with the echo of his words. Silence or justice? The phrase became a drumbeat in my head, haunting me through the rest of the day and into the long, dark hours of the night. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't advice. It was a simple, brutal statement of fact. For my entire life, I had chosen silence. I had called it survival. I had called it keeping the peace. I had called it not making things worse. But he had given it its true name. It was just silence. And the opposite of that silence wasn't noise. It was justice. The words reframed my entire mission. This wasn't just about revenge anymore, about causing pain because pain had been caused to me. It was about rebalancing the scales, about forcing the truth into a space that had only ever held lies. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I had never felt before. The choice had been made. I sat at my laptop, my fingers moving with a decisive energy. I opened a new message in a secure, anonymous email account I had created weeks ago. The recipient was the public email address for the Willow Bend City Council's administrative office. The subject line was simple, regarding the city fleet maintenance contract. In the body of the email, I wrote a short, professional message, posing as a concerned citizen and former employee of Linton's Automotive. I wrote about financial irregularities I had witnessed. Then, I opened the files on my secret USB drive. I attached the spreadsheet showing the real income versus the fraudulent tax prep numbers. I attached a copy of a fake Westline Parts invoice. I attached one of the emails detailing a cash reimbursement to Rachel. I compiled a neat, undeniable package of Carl's corruption. My finger hovered over the send button. The world could change with a single click. But I stopped. My own reflection stared back at me from the dark screen. Sending the email now felt incomplete. It was too clean. An anonymous tip could be buried, explained away. Carl would lawyer up. He would paint the whistleblower as a disgruntled employee. The town would see a man fighting a faceless accusation. They wouldn't see the monster. They would only see the numbers. And numbers could be argued. I needed them to see him. I needed them to see the truth of his character, not just the evidence of his crimes. I closed the draft, saving it for later. My plan needed another layer. Carl had built his reputation on the image of the honest, hard-working family man. I needed to show Willow Bend the man he was behind closed doors. The video from Mr. Gray was of a private moment, a family matter, to the outside world. That could be spun. I needed to show his public corruption, however small. That afternoon, I walked next door. Mr. Gray was pruning his rose bushes. I told him I'd been thinking of taking up a hobby, something creative. I mentioned nature photography, the birds in the woods behind our houses. I asked him if he knew anything about cameras, if he had any old equipment I could borrow to see if I liked it. He looked at me, a long, appraising look. He didn't question my sudden interest in photography. He didn't ask why. He simply wiped his hands on a rag and said, "I think I have just the thing." He returned not with a large, clunky DSLR, but with a camera so small it fit in the palm of my hand. It was a high-resolution spy camera, disguised as a USB phone charger. He showed me how it worked motion-activated. Long battery life, clear video and audio. He didn't ask what I was planning to photograph with it. He didn't have to. We were co-conspirators in a plot that was never spoken aloud. The next Thursday night was Carl's poker night. It was a weekly ritual. 2 of his mechanics and a guy from the local auto parts store would come over after the shop closed. Donna would make them sandwiches and then retreat upstairs. They called it the boys' night. I knew it was more than that. I'd seen the cash change hands, always more than the small pots on the table would suggest. My hands shook as I set the trap. The charger camera was a perfect piece of camouflage. I plugged it into the wall outlet in the kitchen, the one near the small table where they played. It had a clear, unobstructed view. It looked completely innocuous. Just another piece of electronic clutter. The risk was enormous. If he found it, I couldn't imagine what he would do. But the potential reward was greater. I spent the night in my room, my door shut, my ears straining to hear, the low murmur of their voices, the occasional burst of laughter, the clinking of beer bottles. It sounded like any other Thursday. At midnight, I heard them leave. I waited another hour, until the house was completely silent and the only sound was the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall. Tiptoeing into the dark kitchen, I retrieved the camera. My heart was a frantic bird in my chest. Back in the safety of my room, I plugged it into my laptop. The footage was there, hours of it. I fast-forwarded through the boring parts, the bad jokes, the talk about cars, and then I found it. Near the end of the night, as they were cashing out, the man from the auto parts store slid a thick white envelope across the table to Carl. "For that inspection sticker," the man mumbled, not meeting Carl's eyes, like we talked about. Carl didn't miss a beat. He picked up the envelope, didn't even look inside, and slipped it into his shirt pocket with a knowing smirk. "Pleasure doing business with you, Jim," he said, his voice smooth as oil. It was all there, a clear, undeniable act of petty corruption. A city inspector in his pocket. It wasn't a violent crime. It wasn't a $1 million fraud. But it was ugly. It was sleazy. It was the kind of small-town rot that people understood, the kind of casual dishonesty that would stain his honest mechanic image forever. It showed his soul. I saved the clip as a new file. I put it on the USB drive with the financial records and the photos of the emails. I had my arsenal, I had the numbers, and now I had the noise. I looked at the new video file, the cursor blinking. I thought about what to call it. I typed in the name, a final, bitter twist of the knife. Family night, the air, a year later, was just as thick with the cloying sweetness of Donna's roses and the greasy promise of grilled meat. But everything else was different. The scene was the same: the manicured lawn, the picnic table, but it had been upgraded. The faded plastic lawn chairs were gone, replaced by a handsome wrought iron patio set. The rusty old grill had been retired for a gleaming stainless steel behemoth with 6 burners. Carl was no longer drinking beer from a can. He was sipping a dark, expensive-looking craft ale from a frosted mug. This was not a simple family cookout. This was a victory lap. They were celebrating the city contract. It had been officially announced the week before. A multi-year deal that had effectively made Carl the king of Willow Bend's small business community. Today's party was less a gathering of family and more a carefully curated press event. There was a reporter from the Willow Bend Chronicle, a cheerful young woman with a notepad, and a few members of the town council, all laughing a little too loudly at Carl's jokes. I moved through the scene like a ghost in a past life. A year ago, I had been the frantic help, my hands trembling as I flipped burgers. Today, I was calm. My heart wasn't a frantic drum of fear. It was a slow, steady metronome, counting down the beats to the finale. My role today was different, too. I wasn't on the grill. Donna, in a rare moment of what she probably considered generosity, had assigned me a new task. "Mara, honey, you're so good with your little camera," she'd said that morning, referencing the camera I'd been carrying for months, practicing for this very day. "Why don't you be our official photographer? Get some lovely shots for the paper." The irony was exquisite. The girl they had so carefully cropped out of their lives was now being asked to frame them, to capture their moment of ultimate triumph. They had handed their legacy to the one person dedicated to its annihilation. I held the camera, a professional-grade model Mr. Gray had taught me how to use, and smiled my quiet, practiced smile. Of course, Donna. I'd be happy to. The party reached its crescendo as the sun began to set. Carl, flushed with beer and adulation, stood up and clinked a knife against his mug. The chatter died down. He cleared his throat, a self-important sound that set my teeth on edge. "I just want to thank you all for coming," he began, beaming at his audience. "This contract, it's not just about business. It's about trust. It's about this town trusting one of its own to do the right thing." He placed a heavy hand on Donna's shoulder. "I couldn't have done it without my family. My wife, my wonderful niece Rachel. They're the rock. This is a family business, and we believe in family values." He raised his glass, to Willow Bend, and to a prosperous future for all of us. A chorus of hear, hear, and applause followed. As everyone lifted their glasses, I lifted my camera. I focused the lens directly on Carl's beaming, triumphant face. As he took a sip, I stepped closer, my voice a soft murmur that only he could hear. "Smile," I said. "You'll want to remember this." He lowered his mug, a flicker of confusion in his eyes. He searched my face for meaning, for the usual fear or deference, and found none. But the moment was too jubilant for suspicion. He dismissed it, a slight frown quickly replaced by his confident grin. From across the patio, Rachel, who had heard my comment, let out her sharp, barking laugh. She sauntered over, a glass of white wine sloshing in her hand. "Look at you. Mara, playing photographer?" she sneered, her voice dripping with the same casual cruelty as the year before. "Still the help. Huh. At least you found a way to be useful." I didn't look at her. I kept my eyes on Carl. I pressed a sequence of buttons on the side of my camera, my fingers moving with practiced ease. The small red light that indicated it was recording began to blink. A silent, steady live stream was now being fed directly to a secure cloud drive, a perfect, high-definition record of the next few minutes. Carl must have sensed the shift in the atmosphere, the sudden, sharp tension emanating from me. His smile faltered. He draped an arm around my shoulder, a gesture that looked avuncular to the crowd, but felt like a vice to me. His fingers dug into my arm, a painful, warning squeeze. "Behave," he whispered, his voice a low, menacing growl against my ear. This was the moment, the final cue in a script I had rehearsed in my mind for a full year. I didn't flinch. I didn't pull away. I slowly turned my head, my eyes meeting his, and for the first time in my life, I let him see the cold, hard truth of my hatred. I let him see that the girl he thought he'd broken was a stranger he had never known. I looked from his shocked face to the lens of my own camera. "Oh, I am," I said, my voice clear and steady. And then, I looked past him, across the perfectly manicured lawn, to the fence line. Mr. Gray was there, just as we'd planned. He was standing by his bird feeder, pretending to fill it. He looked like any other retiree enjoying a quiet evening, but his eyes were fixed on me. He saw Carl's hand on my shoulder. He saw my expression. He saw the red light blinking on my camera. I gave him the smallest, almost imperceptible nod. He reached into his pocket. The large, flat-screen television mounted on the wall of the patio, which had been showing a slideshow of idyllic family photos, suddenly went black. The cheerful background music cut out, plunging the party into an abrupt, confusing silence. Everyone turned to look at the screen. Carl's hand fell from my shoulder. "What the hell," he muttered. And then, the screen flickered to life. It wasn't the slideshow. It was a grainy night vision video. The image was of a kitchen table, a poker game in progress. The crowd murmured in confusion, and then the camera focused on Carl as he pocketed a thick white envelope. The audio, crisp and clear, filled the silent yard. "Pleasure doing business with you, Jim." A collective gasp went through the party. The town council members exchanged uneasy glances. Carl's face went white as a sheet. He looked from the screen to me, his eyes wide with a dawning, horrified comprehension. But I was just getting started. The video cut out, replaced by a crisp, clean image of an Excel spreadsheet, lines of numbers under columns labeled actual parts cost and tax claim expense. A bright red arrow pointed to the totals at the bottom, showing a discrepancy of hundreds of thousands of dollars. The murmuring stopped. The silence was now absolute, a deafening void where laughter had been just moments before. The only sound was the aggressive, angry sizzle of unattended steaks burning on the grill. The spreadsheet was replaced by another image, a high-resolution photo of a fake invoice from a company called Westline Parts, the ghost in Carl's machine. Then, the final image, a screenshot of an email, from Carl Linton to Rachel Linton, subject monthly, $500 transferred, for car/expenses. Rachel made a small, strangled sound, like a dying animal. Donna's face had crumpled, her hand flying to her mouth, her eyes fixed on the screen in utter devastation. The reporter from the Chronicle was no longer smiling. She was scribbling furiously in her notepad. The party was frozen, a tableau of ruin. The faces around me were a gallery of disbelief, shock, and dawning comprehension. They had come to celebrate a king and were now bearing witness to his public execution. They finally saw him, not the honest mechanic, not the church-going family man. They saw the fraud, the cheat, the liar. I slowly lowered my camera. My work was done. I looked at Carl. His face was a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred, his eyes promising a kind of retribution that no longer scared me. He was powerless. He was a fraud exposed in his own backyard, in front of the very people whose approval he craved more than air. The silence stretched on, broken only by that single, relentless sound, the hiss and pop of the meat charring on the grill, the fat rendering and burning away to nothing. The smell of smoke was thick in the air, but it no longer smelled like a celebration. It was the stench of ruin. The implosion was faster and quieter than I could have imagined. There was no shouting, no dramatic confrontation. The party simply dissolved. Guests melted away into the twilight, their faces a mixture of shock and a morbid, delicious excitement. They left in a funereal silence, their cars pulling away from the curb without the usual friendly honks. The reporter from the Chronicle was the last to leave, her eyes wide, her notepad full. She didn't try to speak to me or to Carl. She just looked from the dark television screen to my calm face, a silent acknowledgement passing between us. She knew she had the biggest story of her career. By the next morning, the first shockwave hit, the headline of the Willow Bend Chronicle. Printed in a bold, accusatory font above the fold, read, "Willow Bend mechanic under investigation for city fraud following shocking cookout revelations." The article was devastatingly precise. It detailed the suspended city contract, the allegations of tax evasion, and the video evidence of bribery. Someone at the party, likely one of the spurned council members, had recorded the screen with their phone and leaked it. The clip of Carl pocketing the envelope, grainy and damning, was already making the rounds on local Facebook groups, shared with a torrent of shocked emojis and comments ranging from "I always knew something was off about him" to "praying for the Linton family." The digital world, which the Lintons had so carefully cultivated, turned on them with brutal efficiency. Rachel's social media accounts, a curated gallery of her perfect life, vanished within hours of the story breaking. One moment her Instagram was there, filled with smiling photos at charity events and boastful posts about her amazing family, and the next, it was a blank page reading, "Sorry, this page isn't available." The poster of her smiling face was quietly removed from the bank window before lunch. Her social life, her very identity in the town, was digitally executed. Around noon, a police car, its lights off, pulled quietly into our driveway. 2 officers, men Carl had likely shared a beer with, got out. I watched from the living room window as they spoke to him on the porch. It wasn't an arrest. It was a polite, but firm, request. He was being taken in for questioning. He tried to maintain his blustering confidence, clapping one of the officers on the shoulder, but his face was the color of ash. I watched him get into the back of the car. A man who had ruled this house like a petty tyrant, now looking small and utterly defeated. The house fell into a profound and suffocating silence after he left. I retreated to my room, the one place that felt like mine. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel happy. I felt a vast, hollow emptiness, the kind that comes after a long and terrible fever finally breaks. The adrenaline that had sustained me for a year was gone, leaving behind only a quiet, bone-deep weariness. Late in the afternoon, there was a soft, timid knock on my door. It was Donna. She didn't look angry. She looked like a building that had collapsed in on itself. Her face was puffy from crying, her eyes red and raw. She clutched a floral housecoat around her, a pathetic shield against the new reality of her life. "Mara," she whispered, her voice cracking. She stepped into my room, looking around as if she'd never seen it before. "How could you do this to us, to this family?" I remained seated on my bed, my hands resting calmly in my lap. I looked at this woman who had stood by and watched my spirit be ground down to dust, who had chosen her own comfort over my safety at every turn. I felt nothing, not pity, not anger, just a vast, empty distance. "He hit me." "Donna," I said, my voice flat and devoid of accusation. "For years, you knew, you saw the bruises." Tears streamed down her face, but she shook her head, a gesture of frantic denial. "He has a temper. You know how he is. You provoked him. You were always so difficult. This," she gestured vaguely at the world outside my window, the world that was now tearing them apart. "This is different. This is our life, our home, everything we worked for, Rachel's job, the church, everything. Why would you destroy it all? Why?" Her why hung in the air, a question born of a world I no longer inhabited. She saw my actions as a betrayal, an act of spite. She couldn't comprehend that it had nothing to do with her, or with what she called family. It was a simple matter of cause and effect. "I didn't do anything," I replied, my voice as calm and quiet as the eye of a hurricane. I met her tear-filled gaze without flinching. The truth did. She stared at me, her mind struggling to process the words. She was looking for remorse, for an emotional reaction she could understand. She found nothing but a hard, placid surface. The quiet, broken girl she thought she knew was gone, and this stranger in her place was terrifying. She backed out of the room, pulling the door shut with a soft click, leaving me alone in the silence. The next day, I took the next step. Mr. Gray was waiting for me by the fence line when I went outside. He didn't say much. He just told me he had already given a formal statement to the police, verifying the authenticity of the poker night video and providing them with a copy of his own recording from the night of the first cookout. The one of Carl's belt. His testimony gave my evidence an unimpeachable credibility. He was a retired detective. He was a witness. He was the nail in Carl's legal coffin. That afternoon, I performed the final act. I took a fresh padded envelope and placed a copy of the USB drive inside. Every spreadsheet, every fake invoice, every damning email. I didn't include a long letter or an emotional explanation. I just wrote 3 words on a small slip of paper, check the numbers. I drove to a post office in the next town and sent the package to the regional office of the Internal Revenue Service. It was no longer just a local scandal. It was now a federal matter. The following Sunday was a beautiful, sunny morning. The bells of the First Baptist Church rang out across Willow Bend, calling the faithful to worship, but the Linton family pew, third from the front on the right-hand side, was empty. For the first time in 2 decades, Carl and Donna Linton were not in their designated place. Their absence was a black hole in the fabric of the congregation, a void that spoke louder than any sermon. The whispers, I knew, would be deafening. I didn't go to church. I spent the morning in the backyard, pulling weeds from Donna's neglected rose garden. The thorns pricked my fingers, but I welcomed the small, sharp pain. It was real. It was grounding. As I worked, I could hear voices from the yard next door. Not Mr. Gray's, but the family on the other side. 2 women, their voices carrying clearly over the fence. Can't believe it. Carl Linton, of all people, one said, and right there, at his own party. I heard the police took him away, said the other, and his niece got fired from the bank. The whole family is a mess. Then, the first woman spoke again, her voice dropping in a conspiratorial tone. But did you hear how it all came out? It was his stepdaughter, the quiet one. The second woman made a sound of surprise. Really? What did she do? She recorded everything, the first woman said, a note of awe in her voice. She had it all on a camera. I can't believe Mara had the guts to do that, after all these years. I froze, my hand hovering over a thistle. Mara. She had said my name. Not that girl, not his stepdaughter, not the quiet one. Mara. It was a simple thing. 4 letters spoken into the Sunday morning air. But it was everything. In their eyes. In the eyes of the town. I was no longer a shadow, an appendage defined by my relationship to the Lintons. I was a person, a name, an actor in my own story. I pulled the weed from the soft earth, its long root coming free with a satisfying tear. I stood up and looked at the house, the container that had held me for so long. It was just a building of vinyl and wood. Its power was gone. I could hear the distant sound of the church bells finishing their call, and for the first time, standing in the sunlight, I felt free. The courtroom was an ocean of polished wood and muted beige, designed to project a sense of solemnity and order that felt like a mockery of the chaos that had brought us all there. It smelled of old paper and weak coffee. The air hummed with the low, monotonous drone of the building's ventilation, a sound that seemed to absorb all the emotion in the room, leaving behind only a sterile, procedural quiet. Carl sat at the defendant's table, a stranger in a suit that was too tight in the shoulders. The swagger he wore like a second skin was gone, replaced by a pasty, slack-jawed fear. He kept fidgeting with his tie, his movements jerky and unnatural. His lawyer, a slick man with more hair gel than integrity, whispered constantly in his ear, trying to project a confidence that neither of them felt. The prosecution's case was a slow, methodical demolition. They presented the bank records, the tax documents, the testimony of the city council members who had been at the party. It was a mountain of dry factual evidence, but the centerpiece, the heart of the matter, was the video. When the prosecutor, a no-nonsense woman named Ms. Alvarez, announced she would be playing the footage from the poker night, Carl's lawyer shot to his feet. Objection. Your Honor, The defense contends that this so-called evidence has been manipulated. It's a digital fabrication, created by a vindictive and unreliable party to frame my client. Carl nodded vigorously, his face a mask of wronged innocence. He looked at the jury, his eyes wide, and mouthed the word lies. Your Honor. Carl's lawyer continued, his voice resonating with manufactured outrage. My client is a respected local businessman. The idea that he would engage in such behavior is preposterous. His stepdaughter, Ms. Linton, has a history of being difficult. It is our belief that she edited this footage, piecing together audio and video to create a narrative that simply isn't true. The judge, a weary-looking man with kind eyes, looked at Ms. Alvarez. Your response. Gladly. Your Honor, she said, her voice calm and steady. She gestured to the technician. Please play the file labeled Bennett Camera 1. A new video appeared on the large screen. This one was from a different angle. Looking from an upstairs window across a lawn toward a brightly lit patio. It was Mr. Gray's footage. It showed the party, the guests milling about, and it clearly showed me, standing with my camera, pointed directly at Carl. The time and date stamp were clearly visible in the corner of the screen. Ms. Alvarez let it play for a moment, then had the technician pause it. As you can see, Your Honor, she said, turning to the jury, this footage, taken by a neighbor, Mr. Gray Bennett, a decorated former police detective, corroborates the timeline completely. It shows Ms. Linton recording the events as they happened. We have the original, unedited file from her camera. The metadata is intact. The timestamps are sequential. There are no cuts, no edits, no dubbing. She turned and looked directly at Carl's lawyer. The only fabrication here is the one being presented by the defense. The objection was overruled. The poker night video played in its entirety. Carl's smug face filling the screen as he took the envelope. The courtroom was silent, save for the scratch of the court reporter's pen. Then, Ms. Alvarez called her next witness. The prosecution calls Mara Linton to the stand. A hush fell over the room. I stood up from my seat in the front row. Every eye was on me. I felt their stares, a physical weight. But for the first time, it wasn't a weight of shame or fear. It was just observation. I walked to the witness stand, my footsteps echoing softly on the tile floor. I placed my hand on the railing to steady myself, but I found, to my own surprise, that my hand was not shaking. I was sworn in, my voice clear and even in the quiet room. Ms. Alvarez's questions were simple, direct. She had me verify my identity. She had me confirm that it was my camera, that it was my voice on the recording. I answered each question with a simple yes or, that is correct. I kept my eyes on her, avoiding the burning stare I could feel from the defendant's table. Then came the cross-examination. Carl's lawyer approached me, his smile a predatory baring of teeth. He was trying to rattle me, to paint me as the villain. Ms. Linton, he began, his voice dripping with condescension. You've lived with your stepfather for many years, haven't you? Yes. And would you say it's been a happy home? No. No. You've held a grudge against him, haven't you? You felt he was too strict. You resented him. He was my stepfather. I said, my voice level. I lived in his house. But you were unhappy. So unhappy, in fact, that you decided to destroy his life. You spent a year plotting, gathering information, faking evidence, all to get back at him. Isn't that right? I looked past him, my gaze sweeping across the courtroom. I saw Rachel, sitting in the second row. She was staring at her hands in her lap, her face pale. She wouldn't look at me. She, who had laughed at my humiliation, could not bear to witness my quiet strength. My eyes found Donna, sitting alone in the back. She was a ghost, her face etched with a grief so profound it seemed to have aged her a decade. As I watched, she did something that seemed to stop time. Slowly, with a deliberate, almost ritualistic slowness, She twisted the simple gold wedding band on her finger. She pulled it off, held it in her palm for a moment, and then quietly slipped it into her purse. The gesture was small, silent, and utterly final. It was an abdication. I brought my attention back to the lawyer. His question hung in the air. A cheap trap. "I didn't fake anything," I said calmly. "I just documented what was already there." He tried a different tack, his voice rising. "So this whole elaborate scheme, this public humiliation, this was your idea of justice for what, not getting a big enough allowance?" I didn't rise to the bait. I just looked at him, my silence a more powerful answer than any words. He sputtered for a moment, his theatrical anger deflating, and then retreated to his table with a frustrated, "No further questions." As I was about to step down, the judge leaned forward. His gaze was direct and not unkind. "Ms. Linton," he said, his voice filling the courtroom, "after all of this, is there anything you wish to say?" The room was silent. Carl was staring at me, his eyes filled with a venomous hatred. Donna was looking at the floor. Rachel was a statue of shame. I thought about all the years of silence, of swallowed words and hidden bruises. I thought about the girl who believed she deserved it, the girl who thought invisibility was a shield. She was gone. In her place was a woman who had learned the difference between silence and justice. I looked directly at the judge. "Only that truth takes time," I said, my voice clear and steady. I just gave it room to grow. The jury was out for less than 2 hours. When they filed back in, their faces were grim and set. I already knew the verdict. I could see it in the way they refused to look at the defendant's table. The foreman, a tired-looking man in a wrinkled shirt, stood and read the verdict. "On the charge of felony tax fraud, we the jury find the defendant, Carl Linton, guilty." A small gasp came from the back of the courtroom. Donna's head sank into her hands. "On the charge of bribery, we find the defendant guilty." Rachel let out a sob, a small, choked sound. "On the charge of domestic assault, we find the defendant guilty." Carl slumped in his chair as if his strings had been cut. It was over. The truth had grown, and it had finally borne its bitter fruit. I didn't clap. I didn't cry. I didn't even smile. The emptiness I had felt before was now replaced by a quiet sense of closure, a final, full stop at the end of a long and terrible chapter. As the judge began to discuss sentencing dates and the bailiff moved toward Carl, I stood up. I didn't look back. I just walked down the center aisle and out of the courtroom, leaving the wreckage of their lives behind me. The bright sunlight of the afternoon was blinding after the dim courtroom. I blinked, my eyes adjusting, and then I saw him. He was standing on the courthouse steps, leaning against a stone pillar, waiting. Mr. Gray. He wasn't smiling, but his eyes were kind. He didn't speak. He just lifted his hand in a simple, quiet wave, a gesture of solidarity that had started, and now ended, my long war. I nodded back at him, a silent thank you that encompassed everything, and then I walked down the steps and into the rest of my life. I didn't stay in that house. The day after the verdict, I packed a single suitcase with the few things that were truly mine and walked out the front door without looking back. I didn't know where Donna or Rachel went. The house was sold in a fire sale to cover legal fees and back taxes, its contents scattered. The Linton dynasty had ended not with a bang, but with the quiet thud of a realtor's sign being hammered into the perfect lawn. My new home was a small rental at the dead end of a quiet street, a little cottage that had been overlooked for years. It was small and imperfect, with floors that creaked and a faucet that dripped. But it was mine. The silence inside wasn't heavy or threatening. It was a gentle, welcoming quiet that belonged only to me. There were no ghosts here, no memories painted over with cheap beige. The first thing I did was throw open all the windows, letting the afternoon sun and the smell of cut grass flood the dusty rooms, chasing out the last of the shadows. My days found a new rhythm, one dictated by the sun and the seasons, not by the moods of a tyrant. I got a quiet job, doing bookkeeping for a few small businesses in the next town over, work I could do from the small desk I placed by a window, But my real work was outside. The house was surrounded by a rickety, sun-bleached picket fence, and I spent my weekends digging up the overgrown weeds that choked the yard. In their place, I planted lavender, rows and rows of it, until the air around my small house was constantly filled with its clean, calming scent. I would spend hours with my hands in the soil, the feeling of the cool earth a balm for wounds I was only just beginning to understand. I was tending to more than just a garden. I was cultivating peace. Mr. Gray became a quiet fixture in my new life. He never called before he came over. He just appeared, sometimes with a bag of groceries, sometimes with a tool from his workshop. He never spoke of the trial or of Carl. He spoke of the weather, of the stubborn roots of the oak tree in my front yard, of the best way to fix a leaky gutter. He was a steady, unobtrusive presence, a friend who understood that the greatest kindness he could offer was a quiet, undemanding companionship. One Saturday afternoon, he was on my porch, showing me how to replace a rotting floorboard. The air was warm, and the scent of the lavender was strong. I brought us out 2 glasses of iced tea and sat on the steps, watching him work. His movements were economical and precise, the movements of a man who had spent his life fixing things. He stopped his work for a moment and looked out across my small yard, his gaze landing on the old fence that separated my property from the woods beyond. From my porch, you could just see the back corner of Carl's old house through the trees. "Funny thing," he said, his voice a low rumble. He took a long sip of his tea. "For years, you lived on the other side of that fence. You probably spent a lot of time hiding behind it, in one way or another." He turned his steady gaze to me, and now, that same fence, the back of it, is your view every morning. I followed his gaze. He was right. The fence that had once been my cage was now the border of my sanctuary. The barrier that had boxed me in now defined the edges of my freedom. A slow smile spread across my face, a genuine one that reached my eyes. "Maybe it's time to paint it," I said, the words feeling light and easy. "Give it a fresh start." He considered this for a moment, then shook his head slowly. He set his glass down and picked up his hammer, the weight of it familiar in his hand. "Leave it," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "The peeling paint, the worn wood, don't cover it up." He looked at me, and I saw again that profound, weary understanding in his eyes. "It's proof. It's proof that you built peace from the middle of your pain." I didn't need thanks from anyone for what I had done. I certainly never received any, but I found that I didn't want it. The town of Willow Bend settled into a new kind of relationship with me, one built on a foundation of unspoken knowledge. The story of the cookout, of the videos, of the trial, became a part of the town's modern folklore, but no one ever mentioned it to my face. It was in the small gestures that I understood my new place. It was the way the librarian would set aside a book she thought I might like. It was the gruff nod of acknowledgement from the owner of the hardware store when I came in to buy paint. It was the way other women in the grocery store would meet my eye and give a small, tight smile of solidarity. They weren't pitying me, they were respecting me. They knew the story, and in their quiet way, they were telling me they were on the side of the truth. I was no longer an object of speculation or a footnote in someone else's family. I was a landmark in my own right. I lived peacefully, but I didn't forget. Forgetting felt like a betrayal of the girl who had survived in silence for so long. The memories were a part of me, scars that no longer ached but served as a reminder of the strength I never knew I had. They were the stones in the foundation of my new life. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I would wake up with the ghost of fear on my skin, my heart pounding from a dream I couldn't remember, but then I would hear the steady drip of my own faucet, see the moonlight filtering through my own window, and the fear would recede, a tide going out, leaving behind only the calm, quiet shore of the present. I thought often about the words that had defined me for so long, the casual, cruel phrase that had been the catalyst for my rebellion. "She's not family." For years, that sentence had been a judgment, a branding that marked me as an outsider, as less than. It was meant to shame me, to remind me that my presence was conditional, my worth negligible. It was the source of my deepest pain. But sitting on my porch, watching the sun set behind the trees, I realized the meaning of the words had changed. They no longer held any power over me. The pain had been cauterized, leaving behind a clean, hard scar. Whenever I heard those words echo in the quiet corners of my memory, I no longer felt the sting of rejection. I just smiled. Because they were right. I wasn't their family. I wasn't a part of their web of lies and secrets and transactional affection. I wasn't a prop in their perfect suburban play. I had been forced out, and in doing so, they had given me the greatest gift of all, the chance to discover what I was on my own. I didn't need them to exist. I didn't need their name, their approval, or their suffocating definition of love. I had my small, quiet house. I had my garden. I had the steady friendship of a good man. I had my own name, and for the first time in my life, that was more than enough. The Willow Bend Summer Festival was nothing like the Linton cookouts. The air was still thick with the smell of grilled food, but it was mixed with the sweeter scents of popcorn and cotton candy. The laughter wasn't a brittle performance. It was the real, chaotic sound of a community at ease, children shrieking with joy, neighbors calling out to each other across the park lawn. This celebration wasn't built on a foundation of lies. It was a simple, honest gathering, a testament to the quiet resilience of a small town. A full year had passed since the trial. The seasons had turned, washing away the last of the Linton legacy. The garage had been sold to a young mechanic who was slowly building his own reputation. The house, after sitting empty for months, had been bought by a family with 3 loud, happy children whose bicycles were now perpetually strewn across the once perfect lawn. The town had moved on, and so had I. I stood behind a long folding table, an apron tied around my waist, a pair of tongs in my hand. I was volunteering at the community grill, serving hot dogs to a long line of hungry festival goers. My lavender garden had been a huge success, and I had sold bunches of it at the small farmers market, slowly becoming known as the Lavender Lady. My bookkeeping business was growing. My life was small, quiet, and entirely my own. I laughed as Mrs. Gable, the town librarian, tried to balance 3 plates of food at once. I handed her a stack of napkins, our hands brushing. A year ago, she would have given me a look of polite, distant pity. Now, she just gave me a warm, conspiratorial wink. I was no longer a subject of gossip. I was just Mara. The line dwindled, and I took a moment to look out at the scene. Children were running through sprinklers set up on the baseball field. A local band was playing a slightly off-key but enthusiastic version of a classic rock song. And in the distance, through a gap in the trees, I could see a sliver of a familiar sun-bleached fence. The sight no longer made my stomach clench. It was just a part of the landscape now, a landmark from a past that felt as distant as a half-remembered dream. A small tug on my apron brought me back to the present. I looked down and saw a little girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old, with bright, curious eyes and a smear of chocolate on her cheek. She was looking up at me with the unfiltered directness that only a child possesses. "Excuse me," she said, her voice clear and high. "My mom said not to bother you, but I wanted to ask." "It's no bother," I said, smiling and crouching down to her level. "What did you want to ask?" She took a small step closer, her expression serious. "Are you the lady from that video?" The world seemed to go quiet for a moment. The cheerful noise of the festival faded into a dull hum. It was the question that every adult in Willow Bend knew, but would never ask. They had all seen the news reports. They had all seen the leaked clips online. It was the defining event of my public identity. For a second, the old shame, the old instinct to hide, flickered inside me. I could see the faces of the other volunteers at the table turn toward me, their movements slowing, their conversations pausing. They were all listening. I looked into the little girl's guileless eyes. She wasn't being cruel. She was just curious. She was asking about a story she had overheard, a piece of local history, and I realized in that moment that I had a choice. I could deflect. I could retreat into the shadows, or I could own the story and, in doing so, strip it of its power to hurt me. I smiled, a real gentle smile. Yes, I said, my voice soft but clear enough for the others to hear. I saw the little girl's eyes widen slightly. I leaned in a little closer, and that video saved my life. The girl's face didn't register shock or pity. It registered a kind of simple, profound understanding. Oh, she said, as if that was the most logical explanation in the world. Okay, can I have a hot dog, please? I laughed, a real, unburdened sound. Of course, you can. As I handed her the plate, I was aware of a new presence nearby. A local news crew was covering the festival, and their camera was slowly panning across the scene, capturing slices of small-town life. It swept past the children in the sprinklers, past the band on the stage, and then it settled on me, on my face. I knew what the cameraman saw. Not a victim, not a shy, broken woman. He saw a woman in an apron, smiling, a part of the community she was serving. It was a new picture, a new public record, and it was replacing the old one. Over the cameraman's shoulder, in the distance, I saw the fence, and standing near it, watching the festival from his own yard, was Mr. Gray. He saw the camera on me. He saw me talking to the child, and he lifted his hand in that familiar, quiet wave. It was a final salute, a shared acknowledgement of a war won. I met his gaze across the distance and gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was all the thanks that ever needed to pass between us. The camera moved on. The band started a new song. The little girl ran off to find her mother. The moment was over. I turned back to the grill, the heat warm on my face. The life I had built for myself was here, in these small, quiet moments of peace and belonging. I felt the afternoon sun on my hair, a gentle warmth that seemed to seep into my bones. I glanced down at my hands, at the tongs I was holding. A faint, silvery line traced a path across the inside of my wrist, a scar from a clumsy accident with a kitchen knife a lifetime ago. The sun caught it for a moment, making it gleam. It was a part of my story, a map of a past I had survived. It didn't hurt anymore. It was just a reminder that I was a survivor, that I was still here. I took a deep breath, the air filled with the sounds and smells of my new life, and I said the words, a quiet whisper that was meant only for me, a final closing of a book that had been open for far too long. They said I wasn't family. Fine, I became my own. Thank you so much for listening to my story. It means the world to me to be able to share it. I'd love to connect with all of you. So please drop a comment below and let me know where you're listening from and share your thoughts. If this story resonated with you, please consider subscribing to the channel and giving this video a like. And if you'd like to give it an extra boost, hit that hype button to help this story be heard by more people.